morning, I am Dr. Bivek Singh and today I am going to talk about rheumatic fever. So, the first question that comes to our mind is, what is rheumatic fever? What is rheumatic fever? So, there are three terms I want to use at this point to describe the rheumatic fever. And remember, rheumatic fever is multisystem, immunologically mediated, and the third point is it is an inflammatory disease condition. So, it is a multisystem means there is an involvement of more than one system of the body. Let me write, it is multi-system. So, what I told you? So, it is multi-system means there is an involvement of more than one system of the body, more than one system. Second point, the second point I told is it is immunologically mediated, immune mediated. So, immune mediated, and the third point is it is an inflammatory disease. It is an inflammatory disease. So, what do you mean by immune mediated? It means that there is some problem with the immunity of the body. There is a defective immunity of the body. Defective immunity. And what type of inflammatory disease is it? It is a non-suppurative inflammatory disease. Non-suppurative inflammatory disease. Now, can you define rheumatic fever using three terms? The first is it is a multisystem, immunologically mediated or immune mediated inflammatory disease condition. So, the next thing that strikes my mind is, what is the etiology of rheumatic fever? What is the etiology of rheumatic fever? So, I would like to mention the etiology on the right hand side. As on the right hand side, I would like to mention the etiology. So, remember always, almost all the cases of rheumatic fever, it follows the pharyngeal infection. It follows the pharyngeal infection. So, let me draw the arrow on this side. So, pharyngeal infection or slash pharyngitis. There is some relation between the rheumatic fever and pharyngitis. There is some relation in between the rheumatic fever and pharyngitis. So, at this point I want to draw a figure of a pharynx. This is the forehead, nose, mouth, chin, and at this point nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. There is a pharyngitis. So, what happens in pharyngitis? In pharyngitis, the pharynx is red, swollen and congested. Red, swollen and congested. So, almost all the cases of the rheumatic fever, it follows the pharyngitis, but not all the cases of pharyngitis will lead to rheumatic fever. Remember the point. What I told is, almost all the cases of the rheumatic fever follows the pharyngitis, but not all the cases of pharyngitis will lead into rheumatic fever. So, what is the percentage of pharyngeal infection that can lead into rheumatic fever? Only less than 3%. Only less than 3%. So, it means that if there are 100 patients, if there are 100 healthy persons, suppose if there are 100 healthy person, previously healthy person who are suffering from pharyngeal infection at this stage, then less than 3% of those 100%, that means only 3 or less than 3 of the people will suffer from the rheumatic fever. And the next point is, what is the time duration? Now, what is the time duration between the pharyngeal infection and the rheumatic fever? Suppose if you have pharyngeal infection at this point today, so after how many days or after how many weeks you will suffer from the rheumatic fever? So, the average time duration is 3 weeks. Average time duration is 3 weeks. Okay. 3 weeks. I told 2 important points. Almost all the cases of the rheumatic fever follows the pharyngeal infection, but not all the pharyngeal infection will lead into rheumatic fever. Only less than 3% of the pharyngeal infection will lead into rheumatic fever, and it takes in average 3 weeks from the pharyngitis to the onset of the rheumatic fever. So, if someone comes to you and someone tells you that that patient is suffering from rheumatic fever, do you expect that patient to have a pharyngeal infection 3 weeks back? So, at this point, this is an important point. Always remember, though all the cases of the rheumatic fever follows the pharyngeal infection, but the patient may not give the history. He or she may not give the history of sore throat. So, why is it? Because not all the cases of pharyngeal infection are symptomatic. Some of the pharyngeal infection may be symptomatic. Some of the pharyngeal infection may be symptomatic. At the same point, some pharyngeal infection, it goes subclinical. It goes subclinical. These are the points you have to remember. So, as we are talking about the etiology, always remember all the cases, almost all the cases of the rheumatic fever, it follows the pharyngeal infection. Now, the next step is, this was the step 1 that you should learn. Now, step 2, let us see about the relationship between the agent, host and the environment. Agent, host and the environment. So, I am drawing the triangle. This triangle, here is the agent, host and environment. So, talking about the agent of the rheumatic fever or agent of the pharyngeal infection, which organism is responsible for pharyngeal infection? And it is group A beta hemolytic streptococci. Group A beta hemolytic streptococci. This is the agent, this is the organism that is ultimately leading to the rheumatic fever. This is the organism. So, the next question is, there are so many strains of group A beta hemolytic streptococci. Will all the strain lead to the rheumatic fever? Will all the strain lead to the rheumatic fever? No. Not all the strains of group A beta hemolytic streptococci will lead to the rheumatic fever. There are some of the typical strains that has got that potential to cause the rheumatic fever, and those strains are called rheumatogenic strains. So, there are some of the rheumatogenic strains. So, some of the classical rheumatogenic strains are strain 3, 5, 6, 18, 19, 14, 24. Remember the single digit number 3, 5, 6, and the double digit number 14 plus 10, 24, 18 plus 1, 19, 18, 19, 14, 24 and 3, 5 and 6. These are the classical rheumatogenic strains that has got the potential to cause the rheumatic fever. Talking about the host, we know that rheumatic fever is common in between the age group 5 to 15 years of age. So, what is the age group? It is 5 to 15 years. 5 to 15 years of age groups are more susceptible to have rheumatic fever. And what about the sex predilection? So, remember at this point some of the literatures, they mention that rheumatic fever is more common in case of female, but the fact is it is not the rheumatic fever that is more common in female, it is the complication of the rheumatic fever, it is the sequel of the rheumatic fever that is more common in female. So, someone asks you what is the sex predilection, though there is no clear cut sex predilection for rheumatic fever. Rheumatic fever, male is equal to female, but though there is no clear cut sex predilection for the rheumatic fever, but the complication of the rheumatic fever such as mitral stenosis and chorea, I will talk it later, the complication of the rheumatic fever are more common in case of female. So, it is the complication is more common in case of female. Now, the next point I am going to talk about is the gene allele, or what is the susceptibility. So, HLA class 2 alleles, HLA class 2 alleles, they are associated with the susceptibility for the rheumatic fever. And the next point I want to add this time for the host is inadequate hygiene. Inadequate hygiene is one of the most important host factor that is responsible for rheumatic fever. Inadequate hygiene. The next thing is inadequate hygiene. So, I mentioned 4 points. One is the age group, it is more common in 5 to 15 years of age. So, there is no any clear cut sex predilection. The third thing is susceptibility about the HLA class 2 allele, and the fourth thing is inadequate hygiene. So, I talk about the agent, I talk about the host, now I am going to talk about the environment. So, what sort of environment is favorable for the rheumatic fever, or what sort of environment is favorable for the group A beta hemolytic streptococci. So, in environment I want to add one thing, and that is in environment, overcrowded environment favors the rheumatic fever, overcrowded environment favors the rheumatic overcrowded. So, what is the global burden of the rheumatic fever? So, when I go back to 18th century, rheumatic fever, it was common worldwide. Every country there was rheumatic fever, but at this point, at this 21st century, rheumatic fever, it is more common in the developing countries. It is more common in the developing countries as compared to the developed countries. So, global, this is the globe, and as I mentioned, rheumatic fever is more common in the developing countries. That's why rheumatic fever is known as disease of the poverty. It is known as the disease of the poverty. So, this is known as disease of the poverty. Let me remind you the set 1, that is rheumatic fever is a multi-system immunologically mediated and inflammatory disease condition that is associated with the pharyngeal infection, and the organism that is responsible for the rheumatic fever is Group A, beta hemolytic streptococci, and this disease is more common in the developing countries. So this is the part 1 of this section of the rheumatic fever.